On a desolate stretch of Route 66, a battle-scarred Navy SEAL slammed on his brakes, his heart skipping a beat not from fear, but from a devastating recognition. Because through the swirling whiteout of the blizzard, behind a shuttered grocery store, he saw something that shattered his composure. A mother, huddled behind a dumpster, using a trembling pocket knife to surgically carve the rot off discarded frozen apples. She wasn't eating. She was feeding the only clean slices to two shivering children, while she swallowed nothing but the biting wind and her own pride. Her hands were blue, her eyes hollow, appearing like a woman who had already accepted that she might not survive the night, provided her children did. But she didn't know that a protector was watching. When the SEAL stepped out into the gale, blocking the stinging snow with his massive frame, he didn't offer pity. He offered a fortress. He looked into her terrified eyes and spoke the words that would break her chains. The storm is getting worse. My truck is warm. Sometimes the greatest rescue missions don't happen on a battlefield, but in a parking lot. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe in second chances, subscribe for more stories of hope, redemption, and the heroes walking among us. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. The sky was a bruised canvas of iron gray, weeping snow upon the lonely asphalt of Route 66. Silence reigned, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the engine and the biting wind that whispered of coming storms. Nathaniel Nate Cartwright drove his battered truck through the deepening white, a man carved from granite and grief. He was an imposing figure, standing over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seems to carry the weight of the world, his posture rigid, even in repose, a testament to years of military discipline. His face was a map of hard-won battles, possessing a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and a thick, dark beard that failed to hide the jagged scar running down his left cheek, a souvenir from a mission that had taken more than just skin. His eyes, once a vibrant hazel, were now dimmed by the ghosts of war and the crushing void left by his wife, Elena, who had vanished from his life in a screech of tires and shattered glass 2 years ago. That loss had turned his heart into a fortress, impenetrable and cold, making him a man of few words who preferred the solitude of the road to the hollow echoes of an empty house. Beside him sat Bear, his loyal 4-year-old German shepherd, a massive canine with a coat of midnight black and burnished gold. Bear was not merely a pet, but a tactical asset with intelligence shining in his amber eyes. Yet he possessed a gentle soul that sensed his master's turmoil, often resting his heavy head on Nate's thigh as a silent anchor in the drifting tides of Nate's melancholy. As the wipers slapped away the gathering slush, a flash of color against the gray world caught Nate's attention near a shuttered grocery store. He slowed the truck, his instincts sharpening, and witnessed a scene that pierced the armor of his indifference. Huddled behind a dumpster were 3 figures. The central figure was a woman, Abigail, who looked like a wraith in the swirling snow. She was painfully thin, her frame skeletal beneath a threadbare coat that offered no defense against the biting freeze. Her hair, a dull chestnut, escaped in messy wisps from a knitted cap, framing a face gaunt with hunger and etched with the terror of a hunted animal. Despite her fragility, her movements were fierce. She wielded a small pocket knife with trembling hands, surgically carving away the brown, mushy rot from discarded apples she had scavenged from the trash. Beside her were 2 children. The older girl, Maggie, perhaps 6 years old, had watchful eyes that were too old for her face, her small hands rubbing the arms of the younger child. The youngest, Lily, was barely 3, a tiny bundle wrapped in rags, her lips turning a terrifying shade of violet as she whimpered softly, a sound that was lost to the wind but deafening to Nate's soul. Nate watched, paralyzed, as Abigail handed the small, salvaged wedges of white apple flesh to the children, taking none for herself. The image struck him with the force of a physical blow, transporting him back decades to a time when the world was equally cold. He saw his own mother, Sarah, in Abigail's trembling hands. He remembered the nights when Sarah would claim she wasn't hungry, pushing her portion of dinner across the table to him, her smile tight with hidden pain. The memory of his mother's sacrifice, the nobility of her starvation to ensure his survival, surged through him, cracking the ice around his heart. He could not drive past. He could not leave them to fade into the white oblivion. Nate pulled the truck over, the tires crunching loudly on the gravel, and stepped out into the biting cold, Bear immediately at his heel, alert but calm. When Abigail saw the massive man approach, she flinched violently, pulling the children behind her. Her eyes widened with a primal fear, not of the cold, but of discovery. She terrified that this stranger might be an agent of her husband, a man whose love was defined by bruises and broken spirits. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry ice. "We don't want any trouble." Nate stopped, raising his hand slowly to show he was unarmed, his imposing silhouette softening as he saw the sheer desperation in her stance. He didn't speak of the war, or his wife, or his pain. He simply looked at Lily, whose eyes were fluttering shut against the cold. "The storm is getting worse," Nate said, his voice deep and gravelly, yet surprisingly gentle. "You can't stay here. My truck is warm." Abigail hesitated, her gaze darting between the warm glow of the truck's cabin and the dark road behind them. She weighed the risk of the stranger against the certainty of the frost. When a particularly violent gust of wind nearly knocked Maggie over, the decision was made. With a nod of surrender to the elements, she gathered the shivering children, and together they stepped toward the warmth, leaving the rot of the apples and the cold of the past buried in the snow. The engine of Nate's truck groaned as it climbed the winding, snow-choked driveway leading to the sanctuary of his childhood. A sprawling log cabin nestled against the spine of the mountain like a sleeping bear. The headlights cut through the swirling white void, illuminating the front porch where a warm, golden light spilled from the windows, promising a reprieve from the biting cruelty of the storm. Inside, the door swung open before Nate could even knock, revealing Sarah Cartwright, the matriarch of this secluded haven. Sarah was a woman who wore her 68 years with the grace of a weathered oak tree. Her hair was a cascade of silver steel braided tightly and pinned back, revealing a face etched with the lines of 1,000 smiles and a few deep sorrows. Her eyes, a piercing shade of cerulean blue identical to her son's, held a perpetual warmth that seemed to defy the freezing temperatures outside. And her hands, though gnarled by years of hard labor and gardening, were gentle as she ushered the shivering group inside. She wore a thick, hand-knitted cardigan over a floral dress that smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, a stark contrast to the sterile, cold world Abigail had just escaped. Upon seeing the state of the children, little Lily still trembling like a leaf in a gale, and Maggie's eyes wide with exhaustion, Sarah wasted no time with questions. Her maternal instincts, honed by raising a son alone after widowhood and waiting for him through endless deployments, kicked into overdrive. She settled them near the massive stone hearth where a fire roared with life, snapping and popping as if to chase away the shadows of the road. While Nate silently carried in their meager belongings, looking like a dark sentinel guarding the perimeter, Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, returning moments later with bowls of thick, steaming beef stew and warm bread, her movements swift and efficient, a dance of hospitality she had performed 1,000 times. As the warmth of the fire seeped into their bones, and the children, bellies finally full, succumbed to sleep on the plush rug, with Bear curling protectively around them like a living fur blanket, the atmosphere in the room shifted from urgent survival to intimate confession. Abigail sat in a rocking chair, clutching a mug of tea with both hands as if it were an anchor, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Sarah sat opposite her, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythmic sound that invited confidence. When Sarah gently asked about their journey, Abigail hesitated, her voice barely a whisper, as she introduced herself fully for the first time. "My name is Abigail Morgan. My father was Ethan Morgan." The sound of that name caused Sarah's hands to freeze mid-stitch. The knitting needles clattered to the floor, a sharp sound in the quiet room. Sarah's eyes filled with sudden tears, her breath hitching as she looked at Abigail with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. She reached out, her calloused fingers trembling as they touched Abigail's hand. "Ethan Morgan?" she repeated, her voice thick with emotion. "Child, your father wasn't just a man. He was the reason we survived." Sarah recounted the dark days after her own husband, Nate's father, had passed away from a sudden heart attack, leaving her with a young, angry son and a mountain of debt. It was Ethan, her husband's best friend, a man of quiet strength and immense generosity, who had stepped in not with pity, but with dignity. He had found her work, paid off the bank discreetly, and ensured Nate had clothes for school, never asking for a penny in return. He was the invisible pillar that had held their roof up when the world tried to tear it down. The revelation that the man who had saved the Cartwright family was Abigail's father bridged the gap between strangers instantly, turning gratitude into a sacred bond. However, when Sarah asked why Ethan hadn't helped Abigail now, Abigail's face crumpled, the tragedy of her situation spilling out. "He's gone," she choked out, revealing that Ethan had passed away 2 years prior. But the true horror lay in what followed. She spoke of James Morgan, her husband, a man whose soul was as twisted as the storm outside. James was a handsome man on the surface, with a charming smile that hid a predator's nature. But beneath lay a violent narcissist fueled by alcohol and greed. He was a man of sharp angles and cold eyes, who viewed people as possessions. Abigail explained that her father had left a significant inheritance to ensure her and the grandchildren were safe. But James had manipulated the legalities, isolating her, beating her into submission, and finally throwing her out onto the street to claim the fortune for himself. He was not just an ex-husband, he was a hunter, obsessed with control, and he was currently tearing the state apart looking for her, not out of love, but to silence the only person who could challenge his claim to the money. As Abigail wept, Nate, who had been leaning against the wall in the shadows, tightened his jaw, the muscle twitching. A silent vow that the debt owed to Ethan Morgan would now be repaid to his daughter, and that the predator named James was about to find himself hunted. The blizzard outside had transformed from a mere weather event into a siege, a relentless wall of white that erased the horizon and buried the world in silence, effectively sealing the occupants of the log cabin into a pocket of time where the outside world ceased to exist. For 3 days the wind screamed against the timber walls, but inside, the atmosphere had shifted from the tense quiet of survival to the bustling, chaotic rhythm of life. The cabin, which had stood as a mausoleum to Nate's grief and Sarah's solitude for so long, was now filled with the foreign, musical sounds of children's laughter. Bear, the lethal canine unit trained to immobilize insurgents with a single command, had undergone a transformation that baffled Nate. The massive German shepherd, whose muscles were coiled steel and whose jaw could crush bone, lay sprawled on the rug like a discarded rug, surrendering his dignity entirely to the whims of the children. Lily, emboldened by the dog's stoic patience, had taken to using his flank as a pillow, her tiny fingers buried deep in his thick black and gold fur, occasionally braiding the longer tufts. Bear's amber eyes, usually scanning for threats, were half-closed in bliss, though his ears swiveled like radar dishes at the slightest sound of distress from the girls, proving he had not ceased to be a guardian. He had simply changed his mission parameters. Nate watched this from the corner of the room, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand. He had expected the intrusion of strangers to grate on his nerves, to trigger the claustrophobia that often accompanied his PTSD. But instead, he felt a strange, dull ache in his chest that wasn't pain. It was the cracking of the ice that had encased his heart since Elena died. The dynamic in the living room shifted as Maggie, the 6-year-old with eyes too old for her face, approached the stone hearth where Nate was stacking logs. She watched him with a mix of awe and curiosity, her fear of the giant man having evaporated. Nate, sensing her presence, didn't dismiss her. Instead, he knelt, his movements fluid and controlled, bringing himself to her eye level. "Fire needs to breathe, Maggie," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. "You can't just pile the wood. You have to build a structure, a home for the flame." He guided her small, pale hands with his own, hands that were scarred, calloused, and capable of immense violence, now moving with the delicacy of a surgeon. He showed her how to arrange the kindling in a pyramid, teaching her the patience required to coax a spark into a roar. When the fire finally caught, reflecting in Maggie's wide eyes, she beamed up at him, a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. In that moment, Nate felt a phantom sensation, a ghost of the fatherhood he had lost before he ever truly had it. Later that afternoon, when Lily presented a plastic doll with a snapped leg, a casualty of their hasty flight from James, Nate took it without a word. He sat at the kitchen table, using a small tactical toolkit to repair the joint with focused precision. He treated the cheap plastic toy with the same seriousness he would a weapon malfunction. And when he handed it back, whole again, the look of wonder on Lily's face struck him harder than any bullet. He was realizing that family wasn't just a biological imperative or a memory buried in a grave. It was an action. It was the fixing of broken things. Meanwhile, the kitchen had become Abigail's domain, a place where she slowly reclaimed pieces of her shattered self. Under Sarah's gentle, non-intrusive guidance, Abigail moved between the counter and the stove, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables and the kneading of dough acting as a meditation. For years, cooking had been a minefield. James would criticize the salt, the texture, or the timing, turning every meal into a tribunal where Abigail was the accused. But here, the air smelled of yeast and rosemary, and there was no judgment. Nate would occasionally pass through, offering a nod of appreciation, or silently lifting a heavy pot she struggled with. His presence was a revelation to her. He was physically imposing, taking up space with his broad shoulders and heavy boots, yet he exuded a quiet respect that required no words. He didn't hover, he didn't command. He simply existed alongside her, a solid, protective force rather than a looming threat. When she accidentally dropped a glass jar of spices, shattering it, she instantly flinched, curling inward and waiting for the inevitable shout, the explosion of temper she had been conditioned to expect. Instead, Nate merely fetched the broom and dustpan, sweeping up the shards with a calm efficiency. "Accidents happen," he muttered, not even looking up, before returning to his task. That simple non-reaction nearly brought Abigail to her knees. She looked at his back, at the rigid lines of a man who carried his own wars, and realized she was safe. The storm raged on outside, but for the first time in years, the storm inside Abigail's heart began to quiet. The storm finally broke on the morning of the 4th day, leaving behind a world sculpted in blinding white purity. The sun, a cold, distant coin in the pale blue sky, cast long, sharp shadows across the property, exposing the buried landscape. Nathaniel Nate Cartwright stood in the front yard, his breath pluming in the frigid air like dragon smoke as he brought a heavy splitting axe down onto a log of oak. Thwack! The wood split with a satisfying crack, a sound of honest labor that usually settled his mind. Yet today, the rhythm failed to soothe the prickling sensation at the base of his neck. It was the hum, that hyper-awareness he had developed in the sandbox of war, a vibrating instinct that warned him when the silence was too deep, when the peace was a lie. He had planned to drive Abigail into town, to navigate the legal labyrinth required to shield her inheritance from her husband, but the soldier in him whispered that the enemy was already inside the wire. Beside the woodpile, Bear was no longer the docile pet of the previous night. The German shepherd stood rigid, his nose twitching as he sampled the wind, the hackles along his spine rising like a serrated ridge. A low, subterranean growl vibrated in the dog's chest, a sound not of anger, but of warning. Nate rested the axe head on the chopping block, his muscles coiling tight under his flannel shirt, his eyes scanning the tree line just as the roar of engines shattered the morning calm. A black SUV, mud-spattered and aggressive, crested the hill, followed closely by a battered pickup truck. They didn't slow down. They tore up the driveway, tires churning the pristine snow into brown slush, violating the sanctuary Sarah had built. The vehicles skidded to a halt mere yards from where Nate stood. The doors flew open, and the silence was murdered by the slamming of metal. From the passenger side of the SUV stepped James Morgan. He was a man who possessed the kind of face that would be handsome if not for the rot seeping from within. He had sharp, aristocratic features, slicked-back blonde hair that gleamed in the sunlight, and pale, watery blue eyes that held the manic glint of a desperate addict. He wore a camel-hair coat that cost more than Nate's truck, but it was stained and wrinkled, betraying days of frantic searching. James was a man used to getting his way through charm or force, and currently the charm had been stripped away to reveal the abuser underneath. He gripped a rusted tire iron in his manicured hand, his knuckles white, his posture twitchy and aggressive. "Abigail!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and entitlement, spitting the name like a curse. "I know you're in there, you ungrateful bitch. Get out here and sign the damn papers." James was not alone. From the pickup truck emerged 3 men, hired muscle picked from the bottom of the barrel. The first was a hulking brute named Tiny, a wall of fat and muscle with a shaved head and a neck tattoo of a scorpion, wearing a leather vest despite the freezing cold. His eyes were dull, indicating a man who followed orders without a conscience. The other 2 were wiry, meth-ravaged opportunists, twitching with nervous energy, holding baseball bats and looking at the large house with greedy eyes. They fanned out behind James, a pack of hyenas emboldened by their leader's frenzy. Inside the house, Nate could see Abigail's face pressed against the window, a mask of sheer terror, with Sarah pulling her back protectively. Nate didn't move toward the house. He stepped between the men and the porch, his boots planting firmly in the snow. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply rested the handle of the axe against his thigh, his face a stone mask of indifference that was far more terrifying than James's screaming. "You're trespassing," Nate said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the crisp air. James sneered, stepping forward, waving the tire iron dismissively at Nate. "Move aside, lumberjack. This is a domestic dispute. It's none of your business unless you want to be buried in this snow." James laughed, a jagged, humorless sound, unaware that he wasn't threatening a gardener, but a man who had hunted monsters far worse than him in the darkest corners of the earth. Bear took a step forward, his lips curling back to reveal ivory daggers, waiting for a single command. The predator had arrived, but he had severely miscalculated who the prey was. The air between the porch and the intruders crackled with a tension so thick it felt like ozone before a lightning strike. Abigail Morgan stood behind the screen door, her knuckles white as she gripped the frame, her body forming a trembling but immovable shield around Maggie and Lily. For the first time in years, the urge to flee was overridden by a ferocious, maternal defiance. She was done running, anchored by the sturdy presence of Sarah Cartwright, who stood on the threshold like an ancient gatekeeper, her silver eyes blazing with a matriarchal fury that dared the men to cross her property line. James Morgan, seeing his wife's refusal to cower and the defiance of the old woman, felt his fragile ego fracture. His face twisted into a mask of ugly, red-faced rage. the veneer of the sophisticated air dissolving to reveal the playground bully. "Get them!" James screamed, pointing his tire iron at the house, his voice shrill and breaking. "Drag her out, and break that lumberjack's legs if he moves!" The command hung in the air for a split second before violence erupted. The three hired thugs surged forward, fueled by adrenaline and the promise of easy money. To them, Nate was just a large man with an axe. Imposing, sure, but outnumbered 3-1. They didn't see the shift in Nate's posture. They didn't see the switch flip behind his hazel eyes. The man who had gently taught a child to build a fire vanished, replaced by the Tier 1 operator who had cleared rooms in the most hostile corners of the earth. Nate didn't roar. He went terrifyingly silent. He dropped the axe, a tool too clumsy for the surgical precision required here, and stepped into the chaotic space with fluid, terrifying grace. Tiny, the hulking brute with the scorpion tattoo, reached him first, swinging a heavy fist meant to shatter a jaw. Nate didn't block it. He slipped inside the arc of the punch, his movement a blur of efficiency. With a sickening crunch, Nate drove his elbow into the man's solar plexus, collapsing the giant's lung capacity in an instant, followed immediately by a sweeping kick to the back of the knee that sent 300 pounds of muscle crashing into the snow, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The second thug, one of the wiry meth heads, hesitated for a microsecond upon seeing his largest ally felled so easily, but momentum carried him forward, swinging a baseball bat in a wild, horizontal arc. Nate ducked under the swing with practiced ease, the bat whistling harmlessly overhead. In one smooth motion, Nate grabbed the man's wrist, applying a joint lock that leveraged torque against bone. The thug screamed as his arm was twisted to a supernatural angle, the bat dropping from his nerveless fingers. Nate shoved him into the snow, neutralizing him without unnecessary cruelty, his breathing barely elevated. However, the chaos of the melee had created a blind spot. The third thug, the quietest and most vicious of the group, had circled wide, pulling a serrated hunting knife from his belt. Seeing Nate's back turned while dispatching the second man, he lunged, the blade glinting in the cold sun, aiming for Nate's kidney. It was a fatal miscalculation. Bear, who had been holding a stay command with trembling restraint, saw the blade. The command dissolved. The dog launched himself from the porch, an 80-pound missile of black and gold fur moving faster than human reaction time. A guttural roar tore from the dog's throat as he intercepted the attacker mid-lunge. Bear's jaws, capable of exerting hundreds of pounds of pressure, clamped onto the knife-wielding arm. The thug shrieked in agony as bone met tooth, the knife flying into a snowbank. Bear didn't maul indiscriminately. He held the arm, dragging the man to the ground and pinning him, a growl rumbling in his chest like a running engine, daring the man to move. Witnessing his hired muscle decimated in under 20 seconds, James Morgan stood frozen, his arrogance replaced by the cold dawn of reality. But panic breeds desperation. Seeing a gap in the defense, he tightened his grip on the tire iron and sprinted not toward Nate, but toward the porch, aiming to grab Abigail. It was a cowardly move, targeting the weak while the protector was occupied. But he hadn't accounted for Maggie. The 6-year-old, witnessing the chaos, didn't cry. Her small hand grabbed a heavy piece of oak firewood from the stack Nate had built. With a shout that was more a squeak of defiance, she hurled it with all her might. The wood tumbled through the air and struck James squarely in the shin. It wasn't a damaging blow, but the shock of it, the sheer audacity of a child fighting back, caused James to stumble, his momentum broken just long enough for a shadow to fall over him. He looked up to see Nate standing there, the fight over, his face a mask of absolute, icy judgment. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than the storm. James Morgan, the man who had terrorized his family with the impunity of a king in his own castle, now lay face first in the snow, his expensive camel hair coat ruined by mud, and the crushing weight of Nate Cartwright's knee pressed firmly between his shoulder blades. Nate did not shout. He did not boast. He simply held James's wrists in a grip of iron, using a zip tie he had pulled from his tactical pocket, a habit from a life where readiness was the only religion. James spat curses into the ice, his face a mask of red-faced humiliation and impotent rage, stripping away the veneer of the sophisticated businessman to reveal the petulant, broken child underneath. The 3 hired thugs lay groaning in the yard, guarded by Bear, whose low, rumbling growl was the only barrier needed to keep them pinned to the frozen earth. The dog's hackles were still raised, his amber eyes shifting between the fallen men, waiting for a reason to engage again, a perfect engine of controlled aggression. From the distance, the wail of sirens cut through the thin mountain air, growing louder until the flashing blue and red lights painted the snow in surreal, strobing colors. 2 sheriff's cruisers drifted up the icy driveway, tires crunching with authority. Out stepped Sheriff Miller, a man carved from the same rugged landscape as the mountains themselves. Miller was in his late 50s, with skin the texture of tanned leather and a thick, salt-and-pepper mustache that hid a mouth rarely given to smiling. He wore a heavy sheepskin jacket over his uniform, his movements slow and deliberate, the gait of a man who had seen everything the county had to offer and was surprised by none of it. He tipped his wide-brimmed hat to Sarah, whom he had known for decades, before his eyes took in the scene. The battered thugs, the restrained husband, and the Navy SEAL standing like a statue of judgment in the center of it all. "Looks like you handled the trash, Nate," Miller drawled, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't need much explanation. Sarah's frantic phone call earlier, combined with the bruised knuckles of the thugs and the terrified look of the woman on the porch, painted a clear enough picture. As Miller and his deputies handcuffed James and his accomplices, reading them their rights, James began to scream about lawsuits and property rights, his voice shrill and desperate. Miller simply tightened the cuffs, looking at James with cold disdain. "You're in my county now, son," Miller said, "and we don't take kindly to men who hunt women and children." The click of the cruiser doors shutting on James was the most beautiful sound Abigail had ever heard, a final, metallic period at the end of a long, terrifying sentence. With the threat removed, the adrenaline that had been holding Abigail upright suddenly evaporated, leaving her trembling violently. She collapsed onto her knees on the porch, pulling Maggie and Lily into her chest, burying her face in their hair as great, heaving sobs tore from her throat. It was the weeping of a dam breaking, years of held-back terror flowing out all at once. Nate, having finished his report to the sheriff, walked up the steps. The transformation was immediate. The warrior who had dismantled 3 men vanished, replaced by a man of profound gentleness. He knelt beside them, not too close, respecting their space. "It's over, Abigail," he said, his voice a low rumble, softer than the wind. "He can't touch you. Not ever again." He reached out, his large, scarred hand hesitating for a moment before gently tilting her chin up to check for injuries. His hazel eyes scanned her face with clinical concern, but also deep human empathy. There were no bruises from today, only the old, invisible scars that would take longer to heal. He brushed a stray lock of hair from Lily's tear-stained cheek, offering the child a small, reassuring nod. Standing by the door, Sarah Cartwright watched the scene unfold with a heart that felt both heavy and full. She watched her son, a man who believed himself broken by war and loss, offering comfort to the daughter of the man who had once saved them. She saw the symmetry of the universe playing out before her eyes. Decades ago, Ethan Morgan had stood in a drafty kitchen, handing a check to a grieving widow so her son wouldn't starve. Today, that son, grown into a protector, had paid back the debt in blood and courage. Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek, realizing that this was not just a rescue, it was a restoration. The storm had brought them together, but it was the shared scars of their pasts that would bind them. As the police cruisers faded down the mountain, carrying away the darkness of Abigail's past, the sun finally broke fully through the clouds, bathing the log cabin, the soldier, and the mother in a light that felt, for the first time in a long time, like hope. 3 months had passed since the storm, and the world had reinvented itself. The biting, monochromatic tyranny of winter had retreated, surrendering the mountains to the vibrant, chaotic green of a high country spring. The air, once a knife against the skin, was now sweet with the scent of thawing mud, pine resin, and the delicate perfume of wildflowers pushing through the soil. The silence of the snow was replaced by a symphony of life, the rushing melody of the creek swollen with meltwater, the chirping of robins claiming their territories, and the rhythmic sound of hammers echoing against the valley walls. Abigail Morgan stood in the center of what was once a dilapidated barn, holding a set of blueprints, but she was no longer the spectral, hunted creature Nate had found scavenging in a dumpster. She had filled out, her frame no longer skeletal, but healthy and strong, her skin glowing with the kiss of the mountain sun and good nutrition. Her chestnut hair was now loose and shiny, catching the light as she directed a small crew of contractors. With the legal nightmare behind her, James was awaiting trial without bail, and the ironclad will of Ethan Morgan had finally been executed, Abigail had come into a fortune. Yet she had not bought a mansion in the city or a ticket to a tropical island. Instead, she had poured the money into the soil that had saved her. She was renovating Sarah's farm, transforming the old outbuildings into a sanctuary and foundation for women and children escaping domestic violence, a safe harbor she wished she had found sooner. She moved with a newfound authority, her voice steady and clear, no longer apologizing for her existence. She wore practical work boots and jeans, a symbol of her grounding, and when she smiled at the workers, it reached her eyes, which were finally free of shadows. Down by the newly repaired fence line, Nathaniel "Nate" Cartwright worked with a rhythmic, meditative focus, replacing rotted posts with fresh cedar. He too had changed. The jagged scar on his cheek remained, a map of his past, but the haunted look in his hazel eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. The hum of combat awareness that had plagued him for years, the constant scanning for threats, the adrenaline spikes at sudden noises, had faded into the background, drowned out by the peace of the valley. He had made his choice. The Navy had offered him a promotion, a desk job in Virginia, but he had turned it down. He had filed his retirement papers a week ago. He had realized that his war was over, and his mission had shifted. He was no longer a weapon of the state. He was a builder of homes. He had accepted a position as a lead instructor for a local search and rescue team, a job that allowed him to use his skills to save lives without leaving the people who had become his life. He wiped sweat from his brow, watching Bear, who was currently bounding through the tall grass like a puppy, chasing butterflies with a lack of dignity that would have horrified his military trainers. Suddenly, a squeal of delight cut through the afternoon air. Lily, now a rosy-cheeked 3-year-old in a yellow sundress that matched the dandelions, came sprinting across the uneven ground. She didn't hesitate, didn't check for permission. She launched herself at Nate's legs, wrapping her small arms around his thigh with the force of a collision. Nate dropped his hammer instantly, his reflexes catching her before she could slip. He hoisted her up into his arms, her small hands immediately patting his bearded face. "Look, Papa Nate!" "Look," she chirped, pointing at a bluebird on the fence. The name hung in the air, simple and profound. It was the first time she had used it. Nate froze for a microsecond, a lump forming in his throat that felt larger than any grief he had ever swallowed. Papa Nate. It wasn't a title he had inherited by blood, but one he had earned through protection, patience, and presence. He looked at the little girl, then at Maggie, who was reading a book under the shade of an oak tree nearby, and finally at Abigail, who was watching them from the barn door with a soft, knowing smile. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the sky in strokes of violet and gold, Nate and Abigail sat side by side on the porch swing. The air was cooling, but they didn't need coats. Sarah was inside, humming as she prepared dinner, the matriarch whose kindness had started it all. In the orchard beyond the yard, the apple trees, the very symbol of the fruit that had once been a source of starvation, were heavy with blossoms, promising a harvest of sweetness in the fall. Nate reached out, taking Abigail's hand in his. His rough, calloused palm engulfed her smaller, smoother one, fitting together like two pieces of a broken world made whole. They didn't need to speak. The nightmare of the blizzard, the rot of the garbage apples, and the violence of the past were gone, composted into the soil to feed this new beginning. They sat in the quiet, listening to the wind in the trees, no longer waiting for the storm, but simply watching the garden grow. This story reminds us that sometimes the miracles we pray for do not arrive with thunder, but in the quiet, unexpected appearance of a stranger during our darkest storms. Nate and Abigail were both wandering in their own personal winters, yet God wove their broken paths together, transforming a desperate moment over discarded apples into a harvest of hope and family. It serves as a powerful testament that even when we feel forgotten in the cold, we are being guided toward a restoration we cannot yet see. Never lose faith that your season of spring is coming, for God often saves the best chapters for last. If this story of redemption touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement. Like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Tell us in the comments if you have ever found a blessing in disguise. May God bless you and your loved ones, keeping you safe and warm through every storm.